Good morning. I'm Grant Helbley. I'm a member in discernment, approved for ordination in the United Church of Christ, a member of this community. How much is a life worth? What is the right equation for us to determine value of life versus economic profit? There are three things that they told me in seminary I probably shouldn't talk about in church. Actually, I went to a progressive seminary. They said I should, but I'd get in trouble for it. Money, sex, and power. Probably shouldn't talk about it at work either. We're going to talk about all of them today because they are important words for us to know and to use when we're talking about the value of human lives in our world today. Our story is from the book of John, and it requires some background. The story is set in a particular context. I grew up in an evangelical tradition where we took our Bibles to church, we knew them backwards and forwards, but some of you didn't, and that's okay. So I'm going to give you the good parts version. I'm going to summarize where we are in the midst of this complex story. Here's what you need to know. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are sisters and brother. As far as we know, they live together in the town of Bethany, and Jesus visits their house often whenever he's in town. First century Judea is basically, according to the scholarly article I just read, a collection of serfdoms in which each town consists of one rich landowner who pays taxes to Caesar and the serfs and slaves who work the land. In this case, the rich landowner appears to be named Simon, and he's a Pharisee. Our story is set in Simon's house at a feast in honor of Jesus because Jesus just raised Lazarus from the dead, and that's a big deal. At some point earlier in the story of John, in John's telling of Jesus' life, some leaders are unhappy with Jesus' teaching, so they decide to trick him into publicly breaking the law of Moses by dragging a woman caught in the very act of adultery to him, throwing her at his feet, and asking if he agrees with the law of Moses that demands she be stoned to death. The woman may or may not have been Mary, but it would have been a pretty nasty trick for them to choose a woman who they knew was one of his close friends. And church tradition suggests that she might have been the same woman. Jesus deflects by writing things on the ground, and all of her accusers quietly leave. He then tells the woman she has no accusers left, including himself, and to go home. Shortly before our story, Mary sends an urgent message to Jesus to come to Bethany quickly because Lazarus is sick. Jesus chooses not to hurry at all, arrives in Bethany far too late, after Lazarus has already died. Mary falls at his feet crying, asking why he didn't come sooner. He goes to the tomb, calls Lazarus by name, and Lazarus walks out alive. So there you have it. That's your summary. Now our text picks up when Jesus has returned to Bethany and is at the feast. Martha is serving, which suggests that her relationship with Simon is one of service. She's probably one of his serfs or slaves. Lazarus, who is probably also of the same status, is the star of the hour because he was just dead, so he's allowed to recline at the table. Mary shows up at the party and makes a spectacle of herself by pouring expensive perfume on Jesus' feet, wiping it with her hair, taking her hair down in public, getting her face muddy with his feet. There's exposure, touch, affection. Luke, who also writes about this story and is a little less gentle than John, informs us Mary had a sinful past and leaves us to just assume the rest. He also tells us that she would not stop kissing Jesus' feet, which makes you wonder if anyone tried to make her stop and what that looked like. But the point is, kissing someone's feet is a very powerful and universal sign of deep affection, respect, love, and devotion. So one has to look at this text sideways while squinting, with a pretty strong conviction in Jesus' celibacy, to see this scene as anything but erotic. And by the way, reading scripture while squinting sideways is a time-honored tradition. And there's a really good reason for this. Some of it is really uncomfortable and inappropriate. I'm going to argue later that this is a class problem, not actually a sensibilities problem. And that when we understand certain things about the class rules Jesus is operating under, we understand a lot more about his teachings and his actions. Whether this Mary is the same one who was just a few months ago at Jesus' feet in a very different compromised position or not is something we can't prove one way or another. But that story, the fact that it's in John, does tell us a lot about gender and power dynamics in the world of Jesus and Mary. It's a world where women alone are assumed guilty for actions that necessarily involve more than one person. Mary was not accused of masturbating. It's a world where gender and class determines who's guilty and who is not even present at the trial. In fact, it's impossible, given the power dynamics of this world, that Mary was anything but a victim of sexual abuse. If her abuser was so much more powerful than her that he didn't even have to show up at the trial, it is impossible that she had the power to consent. It's not unusual for this to happen, is it? Power was then and still is the ability to remain anonymous. It's very possible that Mary knows what men with power are like and what it feels like to be forced to bear the sins of patriarchy alone. She's no stranger to public exposure and humiliation. Whether it was while grief-struck from her brother's death or as a prop in licentious stories told by others about her, she's been at Jesus' feet before. She's seen Jesus' power to restore life, forgive sins, and send oppressors slinking home. She knows exactly why she loves him. She knows that what he does with his power is different than anything she has ever experienced before. Don't you tell me you wouldn't have fallen in love with him too. Mary had been told that her body was dirty and defiled because of things others did to her she did not have the power to stop, but she was responsible for. And we too have been conditioned by thousands of years of Western colonization to think of our bodies and our emotions as dangerous, dirty, and feminine things. Certainly not befitting of respectable or religious people. Most of us grew up, as a consequence, under the very old Christian assumption that Jesus was celibate. And I'm not going to take that on now, but let's notice it. Let's just acknowledge that it's there. Let's name it as an assumption. Maybe a deeply held one, but not an objective fact, not explicitly or implicitly stated or denied in the Gospels. It leaves room for individual interpretation. What matters is that the most powerful man Mary ever met took nothing from her. Mary gave what she had out of her overwhelming love and gratitude, and it was accepted with an enthusiastic yes. She used her body to provide pleasure for his body because he had demonstrated concern for her family and her people, and she trusted him. Those who had demonstrated no concern for her, however, felt entitled to tell her how to use her body and her resources simply because they had more social power than her, and their primary concern is their own profit. Let's talk about profit and bodies. We're a society obsessed with profit, with a good deal, with a good sale, with getting something for very little, with accumulating things and money until we've won. And what do we win? We win worth. We win social capital that we can use to get more respect from strangers, a better job, increased safety from external threats, and other intangible rewards that come with privilege. We do win. We win something. In short, we increase our power. Power is the capacity to make choices about where a person lives, how one spends their time, and ultimately what the future will look like for them and for others they have power over. And there's no doubt that money is power. And so we all want more of it. Because power is the difference between being able to keep yourself safe and not. Power's fun. Power's hot. Can I be honest for a moment? Power to raise the dead is real hot. It's the energy behind every good thing we do in the world. Power is also often dangerous, coercive, and destructive. Power doesn't kill people. People with power kill people. Power means choices, and choices mean consequences and responsibility. And we don't all have power over disease and death like Jesus did, but we all have power over something. If you are the one who does the grocery shopping in your home, you have the power over what your family eats. If you're a parent, you have power over almost every aspect of your children's lives. If you ever buy things, you have the power to benefit from someone else's labor. And that power comes with responsibilities. Are you feeding your family things that are good for them? Are you making choices that benefit the well-being of your children? Most of us probably are doing our best to answer yes to that question. Was the person who labored for you free to make other choices and compensated for their labor? That's a difficult question to answer. That's harder. It's harder because of the lack of personal connection. It's harder because of anonymity. I have only very limited ways of knowing the conditions the people who made the clothes I'm wearing lived under, and part of me may not even want to know, because anonymity protects me from feeling the consequences or accepting the responsibility. It would be hard to figure it out. Here's the thing: avoiding responsibility for power becomes easier the farther you are removed from those who are impacted by the way you use your power. It is in the interest of those who already have power to be anonymous and individualistic, because then they can focus on increasing their power through profit without having to be held responsible personally for the impact it has on others. Everyone's responsible for themselves, right? It's in the best interest of those who have limited power to use their power to build alliances, relationships, because each individual benefits by pooling their individual power toward a common good. This arrangement requires more accountability to others, but it also offers more of a safety net in crisis. Do you hear what I'm saying? Two different ways to approach power. Use your power to build relationships so that you can take care of each other, because everyone is working to survive together. Or use your power to build personal profit, and try not to be too connected to the long-term rippling impact it has. There's a handout in your bulletin I want you to pull out. It looks like this. It says, hidden rules among classes. I'm going to argue that Jesus, in his actions and in his words models the values and rules of people living in poverty by putting people over things as the most valued kind of possession, by talking about money as something to be spent and used instead of hoarded, saved, or managed, by talking about being more concerned about the present than the past or the future, and by focusing more on relational emphasis, social inclusion, rather than individuality, which is described here as self-governance and self-sufficiency, or social exclusion. Power is ubiquitous, and power is not bad. But learning how to use power when we have so few positive examples or models is challenging. And it's a heavy responsibility. And it's a thing Jesus models for us very well. Some of us have more power than others, but we all have it. We all have some. It's likely to be abusive or coercive the more anonymous it becomes. That is, the less relational. Non-coercive power is people first and relational. People are valued over anything else. This is what Emma Gonzalez in our modern testimony is trying to tell us. This is what the Florida teenagers are intuitively understanding and trying to tell us. They're holding their representatives responsible for their actions because they know that those actions directly impact them and their safety. Any power you have makes you accountable to others for how you use it. Power should not be a get-out-of-responsibility-free card. It shouldn't mean that you don't have to show up at the trial. Those responsible for suffering in the world are not the disempowered. It is those whose actions have created unsafe conditions for others who have the power and responsibility to change them. Emma wants to live in a world where the individual lives of many are valued over the profits of a few. And I think most of us do too. How do we make that world happen? Mary's public expression of love and devotion to Jesus opens her up to public ridicule because there's vulnerability inherent in any extravagant act of love. Most of us know this. Expressions of love leave us vulnerable. Saying I love you is probably harder if you've been socialized to always be strong and invulnerable. And those who are most likely to bring accusations might be those who are anonymously responsible. Luke tells us that Simon brought up serious concerns about Mary's reputation and morality when she touched Jesus, which is an interesting point, since he's the primary suspect in her abuse as the most powerful man in that city. So what about the accusation that she mismanaged her money? People with more power are very fond of telling people with less power how to use their few resources more wisely. Are you following me? Let's look at that accusation, that Mary mismanaged her money by lavishing it on Jesus in an extravagant act of gratitude instead of giving it to the poor by way of Judas's personal for-profit account. The perfume was worth a year's wages, which sounds like a lot, right? For many of us, it probably is. Do you know what a year's wages represented? It was the wages paid to a daily laborer. In the United States today, which claims to be one of the richest and most best places to live in the world, a year's wages at the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, yields an annual income of $15,080. Can you fix the housing inequality problem in Portland with that? You might be able to fix it for one person. Mary did not have the power to end poverty. She was a victim of it herself. She did have something of value, and she used it in a relational way for somebody who had done more for herself and her community than anyone else she'd ever met. That is the kind of charity that is about relationship. There is another kind of charity that has nothing to do with relationship and is motivated by self-righteousness rather than love. There's a kind of generosity that increases the power of the giver rather than the receiver. Maybe you've been on the other end of it. I confess I have participated in it. So what is Jesus' way of helping the poor? What does Jesus do with his power? Despite demonstrating immense power in both word and action, he identifies himself as one of the poor, gathers followers from the disenfranchised classes of people, does not use his power to coerce, control, exploit, or build up resources for himself. He doesn't even start a soup kitchen, or if he did, the disciples didn't think it was worth mentioning. However, Jesus' relational approach is hard, labor-intensive, especially emotionally labor-intensive. And since the fateful moment when the Christian church became the religion of the powerful, the stories about Jesus have been sorted, preserved, translated, exposited, and preached by people with power, education, and degrees. It's no wonder we really struggle with these stories. People who have social and financial power over others naturally work in both conscious and unconscious ways to maintain and increase their power. Look at the hidden rules among the middle class. Emphasis on correct management of money. Emphasis on using one's personality for acquisition and stability. Respectability. Emphasis on individuality, self-governance, and self-sufficiency. Focus on the future, preparing for the future, planning for the future, saving for the future. Believe in choices. Everyone has choices. Tends to be patriarchal. What kind of world do we live in? Is it the world of values that Jesus preached? It's not our fault. We were born here. Most of us don't know a better way. We've inherited a system. It works for most of us, some of us, most of the time. It was designed to. But we've been telling someone else's story for too long. And in order to really understand the message and teachings of Jesus, we have to understand the values and the hidden rules of poverty that he and his followers held. It makes more sense when Jesus says, don't worry about the future, what you will wear, or your body, what you will eat. When Jesus says, there was a man whose field yielded a lot of grain, and so instead of sharing the extra, he tore down his barns and built bigger ones and said, I'm ready for the future. But then he died, and he missed out on an opportunity. What Jesus is trying to teach us is easier to understand when we understand that Jesus is speaking from the perspective and from the lived experience of people in poverty. The Jesus I read about is not concerned with looking respectable or padding a savings account or improving the lives of the poor from a distance. He heals, he forgives, he goes to dinner parties, weddings, and individual homes. He hangs out with people who are not at all respectable. He talks about power, he exposes power. He's not willing to use his own power for his own benefit. But most of all, he puts people first. People over profit. He knows what the value of a life is. And his way of changing the world is relational. So now what? I honestly don't know. My task when I'm doing theology is to try to understand the context of the stories and the teachings that I'm reading. Putting that into tangible practice in our modern context, which is full of all of the social injustices that also existed in the world of Jesus, is harder. It's harder. I haven't yet decided that my family and I are going to be homeless in solidarity with those who are. If we ever make that decision, you'll know why we did it now, but that's a hard decision for each of us to do, to wrestle with these texts. The first step is recognizing that Jesus does not belong to the middle class. The next step is owning our own power and thinking about how we can use it in the relational, non-coercive ways that Jesus did, if we want to be a church that truly worships an impoverished, homeless man from the Middle East. May God help us.